Let me tell you, I really wanted to play Sonic Unleashed at 60 FPS. Not just because I like playing games at higher frame rates, but because I also wanted to have as good quality footage as possible for this video. And Sega adamantly refuses to give us a PC port of Sonic Unleashed. Fans have been asking for it for years, but instead all they gave us was a bad port of Sonic Colors. So the only way to play Sonic Unleashed at 60 FPS reliably for the longest time has been to play on either an Xbox One X or Series X, which unfortunately I don't have either of, so I was out of options. It was looking like I was going to have to play Sonic Unleashed just on my Xbox, but just recently, with the most fortuitous timing, the latest Canary build of Xenia now allows you to play through almost all of Sonic Unleashed no problems without any crashes. And I was like, ooh, really? I gotta check that out, what perfect timing. And yeah, I played through the whole game, no problem. There was only one DLC level that I was not able to play, and you know, there are a couple of graphical issues that did appear here and there, especially Empire City, you're gonna see that later. But whatever, that is perfectly worth it if you ask me to play Sonic Unleashed not only at 60 FPS, but also with mod support, and I did throw a couple of mods into my playthrough of Sonic Unleashed, and I'll touch on them as I go. Nothing too huge for the most part, but you'll see as we go. And as always, I'm going to have a link in the description to my spreadsheet where I have all the links to my recommended mods and ways to play Sonic games, so you can check out everything that I'm using for Sonic Unleashed there. Now let's get into it. It's finally time to talk about Sonic Unleashed, and oh my god, do you see how long this video is? We have a lot to talk about. Oh my god, so much to say. So much to cover. I don't even know where to begin. Let's start with this. As you can clearly see, Sonic Unleashed is quite a different 3D Sonic game compared to the last one that this team made, Sonic 06. And it takes a lot of its ideas from the Sonic Rush games, obviously, incorporating the boost introduced in those games into the main Sonic gameplay here. But before we dive into the boost and how it affects 3D Sonic gameplay, a more significant thing that I want to talk about is that Sonic Unleashed is a completely rethought new approach to making a 3D Sonic game. And I want to talk about why I think this happened and what the team's mentality was going into making this game. Because obviously Sonic 06 was a giant colossal failure, due mostly in part to the fact that the game was unfinished. However, I think that that game was very traumatizing towards Sonic Team. I mean, how could it not, after the reception that game received? You know, that is a legendarily terrible game, even to this very day. And I could definitely see that the team, after that game, was thinking that we need to distance ourselves from 06 as much as physically possible, and so they wanted to completely reinvent what Sonic was in 3D to something very different than 06. Which a lot of people nowadays lament in the Sonic community because 06 wasn't a completely worthless game. As I said, most of its problems just come from the fact that the game wasn't finished, but there was a lot there that did actually work and showed promise, and perhaps if the game actually was finished, it could have been a really solid 3D Sonic game. And so a lot of people believe that Sonic Team was overly reactive in wanting to push away from 06 and try to do something different. And I can definitely understand that sentiment, and I do partially agree with it, but at the same time, I can't blame the people at Sonic Team for wanting to just completely denounce 06 and move on from it, and make a new Sonic game that showed that this is absolutely nothing like that game. Plus, also, 06 was following on the same game design philosophies that began in Sonic Adventure, and while the adventure games were pretty well received at the time, all of the games that followed in their footsteps, from Heroes to 06, all received middling to negative reception, and that again I think is a good motivation for why Sonic Team may have wanted to change things up with Unleashed and try something different. Maybe this adventure style of Sonic they were just feeling wasn't working anymore because all their games were getting mixed reception. Another factor I think here is the fact that the team that made these games, 06 and Unleashed, is not the same team that made the adventure games in the first place, That was the Sonic team that was led by Takashi Iizuka, stationed in America. They made Adventure 1 up to Shadow the Hedgehog, but after that they started working on Knight's Journey of Dreams, so I assume that it was up to the Japanese branch of Sonic Team to make the next big Sonic game, which was 06, and then after that was a horrible failure. I think it's very possible that maybe this team looked at Sonic and was like, you know, we don't really want to make someone else's style of Sonic game, we want to make our own version of what a 3D Sonic game can be. That could also be a factor. And also, there is the fact that at this point there was a new head of Sonic Team, as Yuji Naka had left during the development of 06, and Akinori Nishiyama came in, who was the director of the Advanced Trilogy and Sonic Rush. And so 06 comes out and it's a big dumpster fire, and then maybe he comes in and is like, okay, let's try something different. How about we try making a 3D Sonic game like the games I've been making, and thus that would explain why Sonic Unleashed is so similar to the Rush games. Not just in its core gameplay, but also its tone and style of storytelling, but that's something we'll get into in another video. So with those factors in consideration, I'm like, okay, you want to try something new with Sonic, I can't blame ya. What's your idea? What do you got? And what they came up with was basically to reapproach how to do a Sonic game in 3D. Because when I think about it, there are generally two main ways that you see 3D platformers constructed. You either have your big open sandbox type platformers that lend themselves to things like collectathons, and then you have your more linear constructed obstacle course style 3D platformers that take advantage of the 3D space to do more complex and intricate level design than what's possible in a 2D game, and this is the kind of design they were going for with the adventure-style games, but this is the main thing that they wanted to reapproach and change. But they seemed not too interested in trying to do an open sandbox-type Sonic game, as, you know, Sonic is kind of built on the very foundation of a linear beginning-to-end type level. Like, that is what Sonic is. You need to have that for it to be a Sonic game, at least I would argue. So I think they wanted to keep linear obstacle course style beginning to end levels, but they wanted to do it in a different way, and as it turns out, there is a different way. There is a third way to do a 3D platformer, and that is the Crash Bandicoot way. The Crash way of doing a 3D platformer is to literally just take a 2D platformer, which is a straight line that you go forward across left to right, and just turn that 90 degrees so now you're going forward instead of right. And you just add a little bit of width to that two-dimensional line, and now you have a 3D version of a very similar type of design that you see in 2D games. And that is the kind of approach they decided to go with for Sonic Unleashed. Hallway-style level design, where you're going forward in the same way that you go right in a 2D platformer. And I don't at all think that this is a coincidental similarity to Crash Bandicoot. I think that Sonic Team was looking at the Crash games for inspiration, actually, because there are numerous things in Sonic Unleashed that are reminiscent of the Crash games, because not only do we have the hallway-style level design, but the Crash games also go 2D in a similar way to Sonic Unleashed, and they also have sequences where you're running toward the camera, being chased by something, and when the game is being rendered properly, you can see that in Sonic Unleashed, when you collect Wumpa Fruit, they fly towards their location on the HUD exactly how they do in Crash when you collect the rings. That is an uncanny similarity right there. There is no way that is coincidence. I absolutely think that Sonic Team was looking at the Crash games as inspiration for a new direction to take Sonic in 3D. Which I have mixed feelings about, because while I do really like the Crash games, they don't exactly take very much advantage of the fact that they are 3D games. They're very straightforward and simple, and they kind of do feel like 2D games in many ways, and that extends to this style of Sonic gameplay for Sonic that we find in Unleashed. Personally, I would prefer something closer to what we get in the adventure games, where you actually take more advantage of the 3D space, rather than limiting us to just straight lines, which is something that we could achieve in a 2D game. You know, if you're gonna make a 3D game, make a 3D game and take advantage of what 3D has to offer. But again, you know, traumatized by 06, they wanted to steer away from that and try something different, so okay, this is what they wanted to go with. What really matters is how well they managed to make that work. And overall, I think they did a really good job. I think Sonic Unleashed is a very fun game. And in fact, it's my favorite 3D Sonic game up to this point, and a big part of that comes from that I think it does a better job of capturing the core appeal of Sonic gameplay than a lot of the other 3D Sonic games manage to do. And a big part of that is because another big point of inspiration for Unleashed is clearly the Sonic Rush games, as boosting is the name of the game here. Going back to the Crash Bandicoot comparison, where Crash takes the gameplay of Donkey Kong Country and turns it 90 degrees to make it 3D, Sonic Unleashed basically takes the gameplay of the Rush games and turns that 90 degrees to make it 3D. And I already really liked the Rush games, and so it kind of just naturally makes this gameplay similarly fun and enjoyable. A lot of the strengths of the Rush games are also present here in Sonic Unleashed. However, a lot of new strengths are also present, as maybe this is just me, but I just inherently enjoy 3D platformers more than 2D platformers, and so just having 3D gameplay at all kind of automatically makes me enjoy the game more. But also, because the game is 3D and you can actually see what's ahead of you, they were able to crank the speed up a shit ton in Sonic Unleashed. This game is so insanely goddamn fast. The last time they made a Sonic game this fast was Sonic Advance 2, which ended up being a giant fucking mess because you couldn't see in that game. But now in Sonic Unleashed, that's not really a problem because it's mostly a 3D game and you're looking ahead of you so you can see things coming, no problem. In fact, Unleashed kind of leans into the fact that you can now see what's coming up when moving at such an insane speed, and it kind of makes that a big core idea in the gameplay is reactive play. You know, having quick reactions has always been important in Sonic, but in Unleashed, it is really the core of what the gameplay is. When you're moving this fast, you're gonna have to be really quick on your feet to see what's coming and figure out how to deal with it. Unleashed still does have many elements that rely on punishing passivity and memorizing the levels in order to figure out how to do things optimally, but most of the time, Unleashed is really a reaction-based game of seeing what's coming up and figuring out what to do. And I quite like that. To be honest, after playing so many 2D Sonic games in a relatively short period of time for all these videos, I gotta say, I'm really starting to get annoyed by the fact that most of the time you can't see what the fuck is ahead of you in 2D Sonic games when you're moving really fast because the camera is too fucking zoomed in. Like, look at any other modern fast-paced 2D platformer. Look at how pulled back the camera is. Look at how tiny the character is. This is to give you plenty of room to see what's coming up. And it's always been a core element of Sonic's gameplay to not be able to see what's coming up. That's part of the gameplay. But to be honest, that's a part of the gameplay that's kind of fucking annoying. It essentially just boils down to being able to predict what the level design is going to be if you're a freak that's played these games way too fucking much, or just trial and error and memorizing what you have to do. Whereas Sonic Unleashed, because it leans more into reactionary style gameplay, you can actually do things your first try pretty well a lot of the time if you're decently good at the game and you stay vigilant. Of course, it is still a Sonic game, and so replay value and improving and learning the level and getting better and faster is still a big part here, so they haven't abandoned that part of what Sonic is. It's still there, it's just now not as prominent, which is something I prefer. Though, to be fair, granted, the adventure-style 3D Sonic games basically eliminate most of the stuff that you can't react to, and that works pretty well for those games as well. So this isn't an attribute exclusive to Unleashed, but with it being a completely new approach on how to do a 3D Sonic game, they also reapproached how to do these elements as well, and I think their solution is pretty good. This reaction-heavy gameplay works decently well because the speed of the game is just so goddamn high. And that in itself is one of the strengths of the boost, because the boost is such a ridiculously fast thing in this game that if you're new to the game, you're probably not going to want to boost very much because stuff is going to be coming at you even faster and it's going to make it even harder to deal with. And so when you're new to Sonic Unleashed and these boost-style Sonic games, you're probably not really going to boost that much, but as you get better at the game and more comfortable, you can start to boost more and more and more. It's that same exact philosophy from the Sonic Rush games that's kind of the inverse of the classic Sonic games. Those games, they did not give you the speed for free, you had to earn it. Here in the boost games, you just get the speed right off the bat, but the game asks you, are you actually capable of handling this speed? It's up to you to actually commit to that speed and go for it, and be good enough to actually make it work. And so, it preserves a similar element of that idea of getting better at the game makes you faster and faster, to the point where you can get like me in this gameplay here, where you're basically boosting all the time, constantly, and that makes for an incredibly fast-paced and very exciting game. You know, back in my Sonic Adventure video, I did this little model here showing the different types of flow that existed in the different Sonic games. In the original 2D Sonic games, it was very smooth, focusing on the momentum, gaining and losing speed based on the terrain and how you played. But then when you get to the adventure games, it gets very jagged, with things like the homing attack and the constant building and losing of speed to springs and spin dashing and ramps and all this stuff. Well, now, if we want to make an updated version of this model, now including boost games, then they kind of look a little bit like this, where you're at maximum speed 100% of the time, which is a different way of approaching a Sonic game, and maybe some people won't like it as much as other versions of Sonic, but I think that it works pretty well for the most part. It's not my favorite way to do Sonic, but it works and it's enjoyable, so I'm not really gonna complain that much. And of course, this does also hold true for the Rush games as well. I just wanted to talk about this here in Unleashed because more people are going to watch this video. As far as new stuff to the gameplay in Sonic Unleashed other than the boost, which we'll get to, we don't have that much new. Like, we have the sidestep, which is just a quick way to make a little bit of left-right distance, which is useful because with the boost launching you so quickly in one direction, steering is a little bit difficult, and so that can help you make small, precise adjustments, which is good. Wall jumping has been added to the game, and it's the very simple, basic, you just stick to the wall and press jump over and over to go back and forth. It's basically automatic, but, you know, at the very least, they do try to throw in some hazards there every now and then to make sure that you have to precisely jump in between them, so it's okay. You have the stomp, which is a quick, easy way to launch yourself downward to hit the floor early, very useful for many different things. And you have drifting for tightly making corners, again because all the speed you have is launching you in one direction and it's not easy to redirect that, so you can obviously use the drift to help you make tighter turns. Though a lot of people don't really like the drift in Sonic Unleashed, and this one level here is pretty infamous, but to be honest, and I hate to be that guy, you really just don't know how to use the drift if you have that much of a problem with it. It works pretty okay once you figure it out, it's just that it's not really that intuitive to understand because of the speed of this game is so insanely high. To drift correctly in Sonic Unleashed, all you have to do is start your drift on the outside of the turn and drift early, and then it's no problem at all, really. Which is how you optimally drift in a lot of games, but with the speed of Sonic Unleashed, it's basically the only way that the drift is going to work, and once you figure that out, it's really not a problem at all. So, get good, everyone that hates the drift in this game. One thing that's a little bit weird in this game is that they have, for some reason, moved the homing attack off of the jump button while you're in the air, and now it's on the same button as the boost. Which, one, just fucks with your muscle memory after a fucking decade of playing Sonic games pressing jump in the air to homing attack. But also, it's very awkward because it means that if there's something to lock onto, you can no longer air boost. But if there's not something to lock onto, you can no longer air dash. You can only air boost if you have meter. You can only air dash if you don't have any meter, which is all just very awkward and confusing for no reason. So I actually threw in a mod for this playthrough that puts the homing attack and air dash back on jump, so I have access to both the air boost and the homing attack whenever I want, and that makes the game quite a bit better. You can see in the level design why they decided to make it that way. This does enable you to skip some things that you're clearly not supposed to be able to, but at the same time, that just means there's new shortcuts in the game, which kind of just makes it more fun to me, so I am perfectly okay with that. Another thing I like that they've added to this game is the speedometer, so you can see how fast you're going. That's very, very useful for trying to figure out what's the fastest way to get through certain sections. Like, for example, you can see that it's actually most of the time beneficial to not hit dash panels, because actually most of the time they slow you down, which is weird, but I guess whatever. It kind of just turns them into more hazards you have to avoid, so I guess that's fine by me. Additionally, another big new feature that they've added to Sonic Unleashed that is a total game changer is polish. Oh my god. This is the first fucking 3D Sonic game that feels like a finished video game. The physics don't wig out and get all weird all the time. There's not all these kinds of weird collision issues. You don't fall through the floor. You don't have all these fucking problems all over the place. The game works as intended without any major issues, which is like, Jesus Christ, finally. For the most part. It's not like Sonic Unleashed is free of bugs, of course, and there is one problem in this game that really, really sucks. That happens a decent amount, and it is very annoying. For some reason, this game has input reading issues. I don't know what the problem is, but it's not at all uncommon that you press a button in this game and Sonic just doesn't do what you told him to do, and I have no idea why it happens. The especially weird part of it is that it's very consistent. There are like certain parts of the level where if you try to do something at this exact moment in this exact position, you're just not going to do anything, and I don't know why. I don't know what's happening there. That is one problem, but other than that, the game generally works as intended. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows with Sonic Unleashed core gameplay, because there are problems here, or I would say downgrades from the Sonic Rush games, where this game takes the lion's share of its gameplay inspirations, because one of the things that I didn't love about the Rush games, but I think they managed to get around this problem, is how they simplified the gameplay of the classic 2D Sonic games with their physics-focused. The Rush games managed to find new ways to add depth to Sonic gameplay, but Sonic Unleashed actually kind of simplifies things even further and takes away some of the depth that was introduced in the Rush games, because with Rush, the big core element of the gameplay that really fleshed things out was the meter management, the fact that you actually really needed to do a lot in order to keep your boost meter topped up so you can keep boosting as much as you want. In Sonic Unleashed, pretty much all of that is gone. Tricks have been removed from the game, and that whole system where if you waited until your boost meter was entirely filled, then you got infinite boost for a while, that's gone as well. And now the boost meter can be filled simply by collecting Wumpa Fruit, and the big thing here is that you gain so much meter and you lose so little of it by boosting that most of the time you basically have all the meter you would ever need, and you don't really need to think about it. You do a little bit, like you have to kind of go out of your way here and there to collect Wumpa Fruit and kill enemies, just to make sure that you are still earning some meter, which I do appreciate. In fact, that is kind of a somewhat improvement over the Rush games, because they didn't really give you a good motivation to collect Wumpa Fruit. But generally, for the most part, maintaining your boost meter is something that you can really not think about very much at all in Sonic Unleashed, and it's never going to be a problem. Especially later in the game, once you upgrade the size of your boost meter, then it really goes away. There are a couple of levels here and there where there's kind of scarcity in your boost meter, but it's very, very rare. And I do think it's unfortunate, because now the game basically doesn't have that interesting element of meter management and decision-making about how you want to spend your meter and when, and what things you're going to do to build and maintain your meter. All of that's gone, and now it's kind of just mindless boosting all the time, which I don't really like as much. And unfortunately, Sonic Unleashed doesn't really introduce much to replace this lost depth. It kind of just has less gameplay to it than the Rush games did, which already had less gameplay to them than the original Sonic games. So, yeah, I think that they went a little bit too far at this point with simplifying the Sonic formula. But that doesn't stop the game from being fun. It is still enjoyable, it just doesn't have as much meat to sink your teeth into as other Sonic games. And because of that, while I do like Sonic Unleashed gameplay quite a bit, I do prefer the gameplay of the Rush games over it. However, that is only when we are talking about the core main levels of Sonic Unleashed, because actually they are not my favorite part of the game. The main core levels are fun, they're enjoyable, I like them, but they're a little bit overly simple and kinda easy for my taste. It's when we get to the extra levels, and especially the DLC levels, that Sonic Unleashed really comes into its own for me. I know a lot of people really don't like the DLC levels of Sonic Unleashed, but to be honest, I think they are insanely fun. They are by far my favorite part of the game. And like I said, it's not just the DLC levels, but also the extra levels, the Acts 2 and 3 that some zones have. These levels really amp up the challenge over the core main levels a lot of the time, and I think the big level that's gonna be like the one that is make or break on Sonic Unleashed for you is going to be Dragon Road Act 2. You're either gonna play this level and go, this level is a bunch of fucking horseshit, or you're gonna play this level and go, this level is a bunch of fucking horseshit, and I love it, and I fall into the latter camp. I think that these levels are so fucking awesome, and the DLC levels just take this and make it even more so, because what the DLC levels do is they ramp up the difficulty of Sonic Unleashed to comical degrees. They are so ridiculously stupid hard in a very similar way to the kind of super hard mode and expert mode from like Sonic Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog, and kind of also the DLC levels of Sonic 06. But the Unleashed DLC levels, oh my god, they push it into an entirely new region of difficulty. These are the hardest levels that have ever been in any Sonic game, period. And in general, Sonic Unleashed is the hardest Sonic game that has ever been made. And I'm gonna be honest, as someone that just loves difficult games, the sheer challenge of these levels alone is what makes me love them. They are just so ridiculously hard. Like, it's really not that hard for me to get a near-perfect run trying to time attack the core main levels of Sonic Unleashed, but these DLC levels, especially the main ones that are remixed into even harder variants, I cannot for the life of me get a perfect clean run through them because they're so goddamn hard. It's fucking bullshit, dude. There's spikes and fire and traps and enemies fucking everywhere, and the precision you need to avoid all of these things and the consistency you need to do it all in one go, my god, it is absolutely ridiculous, and I love it. The challenge is so much fun to me. What can I say? I love hard games, but it's not just the fact that it's difficult. A hard game needs to also just be fun to play, and it's the combination of Sonic Unleashed simple but difficult gameplay that makes it so good, which again is something that it takes from Crash Bandicoot. Very simple, straightforward, but very challenging gameplay, and that's what I think makes the boost gameplay of Sonic Unleashed really stand out. The fact that it's so stupid, ridiculously hard is what makes up for the fact that the gameplay is so basic and straightforward. It took me so many attempts in order to get runs on these levels that are moderately decent, but I still make a lot of mistakes along the way, and that's what I really like about them, because as someone that has played through every fucking Sonic game in existence and has time attacked them all, I generally find that I can get a pretty satisfying run after just a couple of run-throughs of a level of most 3D Sonic games. But Sonic Unleashed, even after hours of attempts, I'm still not able to get the perfect run that I can see in my head, and that's really invigorating to me. There's still more room for me to grow and get better at this game, and that's not something I can say for most other Sonic games. You know, I sometimes hear from people that really difficult challenges in games that you have to just keep on trying over and over and over, they're not really genuine challenges because it's basically just a matter of time. If you just keep at it, then inevitably you will complete the challenge. Everything will line up into that one perfect run that you need. But that's only when the challenge is already within your skill level. However, if a challenge is too great and too difficult, success is most definitely not guaranteed at all. Like, some games that I've played that are really fucking hard, at a certain point, I just had to stop playing because I'm like, the game is just too hard. I can't beat this challenge. I've been bashing my head against it for so long, and I just have to accept the fact that I'm not good enough and I can't do it. And as someone that is very above average when it comes to my skill at video games, I actually really enjoy that feeling in a game, because most games to me aren't really that challenging at all, and by extension, they're not super engaging, because I can just breeze through most games without really having to put in much effort. It's when games get tough and they start really pushing me that I start to have a lot of fun with the challenges, and when a challenge is so great that I am unable to meet it, I think that's awesome. It presents me with a rare opportunity as a player to not stagnate and actually try to grow and improve further beyond where I already am, and I really appreciate games that are willing to push players of a high skill level as hard as possible. And Sonic Unleashed is the only Sonic game that does that, and that is why it is one of my favorite Sonic games. And it's worth saying that the challenges that they present you with in a lot of these levels, especially the DLC ones, they're bullshit. They are ridiculous. Like, they are straight up mean. I don't necessarily think a lot of them are unfair, but they are so ridiculously unreasonable to ask of the player that it's like, oh my goodness, dude, take it easy. You're just being brutal with this level design. And I fucking love it. It might be a pretty shallow thing to say, but Sonic Unleashed is one of my favorite Sonic games purely based on how stupid hard it is. Okay, so now that I'm finished sucking Sonic Unleashed dick, there is one other thing I want to talk about with the core gameplay of this game, and that would be the fact that it switches between 2D and 3D gameplay, because this has turned into a whole big thing in recent years in the Sonic community, because arbitrarily a bunch of Sonic fans have decided that a 3D game occasionally turning into a 2D game is completely unacceptable. How dare they do something like this? This is a 3D video game, which means that it must be 3D at all times. And the first thing I want to say about this is, my god, could you be more fucking entitled? I understand not liking the fact that these games aren't fully 3D at all times and not agreeing with that choice, but you do not get to tell the creators of the game what their game is. The main argument I always hear against the Boost games turning 2D is that these are 3D games and they should always be 3D. Because, you know, no good 3D platformers have ever turned into 2D platformers ever before. That's never happened a single time. It's impossible for a good 3D platformer to occasionally turn into a 2D platformer, especially not a game that this game is taking its inspiration from. But also, who are you to tell the creators of these games what their games are? People are like, these are 3D Sonic games and they should be 3D, but clearly the creators of these games, the people that actually made them, that's not what they were making. They were making games that switch between 2D and 3D. That's what they wanted them to be, that's what they wanted to make. You can't tell them they're wrong for making a game that switches between 2D and 3D because it switches to 2D sometimes. That's what the game is. Like I said, you can disagree with that idea, but that is not wrong to do in the context of the game that they wanted to make. And also, this whole thing to me seems like it's predicated on the incorrect idea that 3D games are inherently superior to 2D games, and so the moment it switches to 2D, the game becomes trash, which is not even remotely true. While I may have a personal preference for 3D games, I do not think that they are inherently superior to 2D games. It's just a different style of game with different rules and different things that have to be done with the game design. It's just different, not better. And also, like, 2D Sonic games are fantastic, so what's the problem with this game occasionally turning into a fantastic 2D Sonic game? I really don't see the issue there. It seems like people are just like, 3D, because 3D, because 3D. Like, that's really just the only argument that seems to come up from this is, I want the game to be 3D, and so it sucks because it's not. Which is a ridiculous idea. You can be unhappy with what a game is, but you can't criticize something for what it's not. You have to criticize it for what it is. You know, I really like point-and-click adventure games. You don't see me going, this should be a point-and-click adventure game. Like, no, it is what it is. It's the game that they wanted to make. I don't even necessarily agree with this direction for Sonic. I actually think that this is a very flawed direction, but it's the direction they wanted to go with, and I want to, at the very least, look at what they made for what it is. But by far, the biggest problem I have with these 2D haters in these boost games is that it seems like these people think that the 2D gameplay is so drastically different and inferior to the 3D gameplay that it makes these games worse, when in reality it makes them better, because when you really get down to it, the boost games are incredibly shallow games, and this is their biggest problem, in my opinion. I've already talked about how they simplify Sonic gameplay quite a bit, but even more than that, they simplify Sonic gameplay to a point where the game actually kind of stops being a platformer in certain ways. In ways that are very similar to what also happens to Sonic Adventure 2. What I find funny about a lot of people that dislike the Boost Sonic games is that they're like, we should go back to how things were in the Adventure Sonic games. Those were much better than the Boost games. When the most praised game of those, Sonic Adventure 2, everyone's favorite 3D Sonic game, is by far the most similar of the 3D Sonic games to the Boost games in the adventure style. This is something I talked about in my Sonic Adventure 2 video, that when you really look at the gameplay and design of Sonic Adventure 2, the game kind of boils down to essentially QTEs, where the gameplay just becomes press the button you're supposed to press at the right time. And I got a lot of people in the comments in that video saying, well, that's every game, they just turn into press the right button at the right time. So I feel like I need to do a better job of explaining what I mean by that. Yes, at the highest of levels, when you've completely mastered a game and you're basically speedrunning it, a game does just boil down to basically muscle memory. Pressing the right buttons at the right time will make the game do what it needs to do for you to beat it, and you don't even really have to think about the game design. But that is only at the highest of high levels. For 99% of players, that is not the experience that you have in most games. For example, let's look at this part of Metropolis Zone in Sonic 2. At this part of the level, we have this slope here that you go up toward the right, and then you hit a button which extends a bridge which allows you to reach this area to the left to progress forward. That is the designed way that you are supposed to handle this situation. However, Sonic 2 is an open-ended game that allows you to use the physics to get past its obstacles in different ways. For example, you can get up to this ledge and use the spin dash to jump the distance, and you don't even need to wait for the bridge, you don't even have to hit the button. This lets you get through this whole sequence much faster. But even more than that, if you really understand how the Sonic games work and you really know how to manipulate the physics, then you can jump off of the slope in the first place and never even touch the platform on the right and just immediately start going toward the left. This is what I'm talking about. There is not one correct solution to this obstacle. The game is open. You can approach it in many different ways. The player has freedom to look at things and figure out how they want to go about them. And yes, Sonic Adventure 2 does have things like this as well, but the majority of the obstacles in this game do not have this same kind of openness to them. There's just a wall here with a little thing you have to crouch under, and the only option you have to get past this obstacle is to do the somersault. That's it. There's no thought, there's no openness, there's no skill even. You just do it. You just press the button and you cleared that obstacle. It's completely devoid of the kind of stuff that you get in more open-ended game design. And like this point right here, what are my options to get past this obstacle? What are the ways that I can figure out how to do this? Oh, there's only one solution, which is to go up to the trail and press the button and Sonic automatically goes along it. Oh wow, that's really interesting game design. I really had to do a lot of thinking to figure out what the best way to clear that obstacle would be. You see what I'm talking about? This is the kind of stuff in SA2 that I refer to as a soft QTE, where there's basically only one solution, and that one solution is pressing a button. And interestingly, I think another big point of inspiration for Sonic Unleashed, in addition to Crash Bandicoot and Sonic Rush, was Sonic Adventure 2, because this game takes that idea of soft QTEs and it basically makes them hard QTEs. The game is literally a game of pressing the right button at the right time. In fact, it's very upfront about it. You know, take this sidestep section from Rooftop Run. RB, RB, LB, RB, LB. Like, it's literally telling you the buttons to press to clear these obstacles, and this is really the only way to deal with these hazards for the most part. Again, Sonic Unleashed does have some openness and some cool stuff you can do, but the general intended game design here is very similar to the kind of stuff we see in Sonic Adventure 2. Crouch under the thing, stomp through the boxes, do a sidestep section, drift when you're supposed to drift, do a homing attack chain, light speed dash. It's the exact same type of game design. You know, a lot of people criticize these boost games for their very hallway-like level design, but if you look at Sonic Adventure 2, it's really not that different. Most of the levels in that game are also hallways. The boost gameplay is an expansion upon the gameplay that Sonic Adventure 2 started. I mean, if you look at the game's other source of inspiration, Sonic Rush stems from Sonic Advance 2, which stems from Sonic Adventure 2. It all comes back to that game. Really, the originator of the boost gameplay that so many adventure fans dislike is Sonic Adventure 2. And with this style of game design, to be honest, the game isn't really taking advantage of the third dimension very much at all. In reality, you can take a lot of the 3D sections of this game and turn them into 2D sections, and it would change almost nothing about how the game is actually played. The switch from 3D to 2D in these Boost Sonic games doesn't really harm the gameplay at all, because it barely really even affects what the gameplay is like. What going to 2D does is it allows these Boost games to open up with a few more extra ways that it can challenge the player. Not more interesting, not more depthful, not more challenging ways, but different ways. And in a shallow game like Sonic Unleashed, you need a variety of obstacles to keep the gameplay from getting stale, and so switching to 2D adds to the gameplay instead of taking away from it. You know, 3D platforming, especially in these games with their kind of controls, is pretty awkward a lot of the time, which is why the game doesn't really do it very much. But there is a decent amount of 2D platforming in this game, as that's a lot easier for most players to do. And also, vertical platforming is something you can't really do very much in 3D with these kinds of games because the camera is locked behind Sonic at all times. Without the ability to look up or down, you really can't have vertical platforming in 3D, but you can have it in 2D. You see what I'm saying? The 2D gameplay in these Boost Sonic games makes them better, not worse. Everyone begging for them to stop doing 2D sections in these games, what you're asking for is the gameplay to have even less variety and be even more stale, and I can't fathom why you would want that. The real problem here is the fact that the gameplay is so simplistic and shallow that you can't really make it work with just 3D gameplay, so you need to rely on 2D gameplay to prevent things from getting boring. This is the real problem with Boost Sonic games. They're just way too shallow. There's nothing to them, really. They're basically just rhythm games. You just press the buttons at the right time. Now, I think these games do this style of gameplay much better than Sonic Adventure 2 does, because Sonic Adventure 2, if we were to continue with the rhythm game comparison, Sonic Adventure 2 is a rhythm game like this, and yes, I'm using Project Mirai as my example here, what of it? Anyway, Sonic Adventure 2 is a very slow-paced game in terms of when the game actually asks you to do things. There's very long, extended periods of time where you don't really do anything other than run forward, and then the game will ask you to do a homing attack chain, and then you do more running forward, and then you slide under the thing, and then you go through a loop, and then you do a light speed dash, and there's just not too much to the gameplay, like on a moment-per-moment basis. It's like playing a rhythm game at a low difficulty, which is really frickin' boring. Rhythm games only start to become fun once you up the difficulty and have the player doing inputs all the time, and that's where I think the Boost games take this type of soft QTE gameplay and they do it better than Sonic Adventure 2, just because they throw more obstacles at you more quickly, and so that's more stuff you have to do. It's like playing a rhythm game at a higher difficulty, And then the DLC levels are like playing on a super fucking hard difficulty where you're constantly having to do all this bullshit, and it makes this simple rhythm-style gameplay more fun. But without that difficulty, then quite frankly, this gameplay doesn't really have enough to hold a player's attention for a long period of time, I don't think. And that is why, as much as I do think that Sonic Unleashed is a fun game, I don't like the boost gameplay as a direction for Sonic, and this is the direction that they have followed all the way up until today. Still, with Sonic Frontiers, we are getting this very simple, straightforward, basically just QTEs type gameplay, and I think it is really hurting Sonic. Just like the adventure games, I think this is the wrong direction for 3D Sonic. And you know what the biggest shame about this whole thing is? Is that weirdly, Sonic Unleashed actually has some of the best physics in the entire series in a 3D Sonic game up to this point. Like, its physics actually mostly work like how a 3D Sonic game should work. Sonic slowly accelerates up to his top speed, and you have a turn radius where you actually turn slower as you speed up. You can't just instantly redirect all your speed like you can in the adventure games. It feels more like true momentum. And with that, you can use slope jumping, and you even do increase speed when running down slopes and slow down when running up slopes. And there's actually not glue on your shoes in this game. If you try to run up a wall or through a loop and you don't have enough speed to clear it, you're not gonna make it and you're gonna fall down. Oh my god, who would have expected that? And you can't just immediately get rid of all the speed that you have. When you have that speed, you're stuck with it, and you need to work with it. In fact, during the platforming, you sometimes need to pull back against the direction you're currently going in to slow yourself down to make sure you land on the platform, and it's like, holy shit, it's a fucking Sonic game. Like, the game doesn't do it very much, but in the few instances when it has you do 3D platforming, this game genuinely feels closer to the classic 2D Sonic games in 3D than any other 3D Sonic game I've played so far. And you can even go on loops and upside down and on walls in this game without needing any scripting to do it. Holy shit. The problem is, of course, that the boost completely overrides all of these systems and basically makes them irrelevant, and the strict level design QTE game design that this game has going on doesn't really allow for you to use these physics in a way that actually takes advantage of 3D and feels like a Sonic game in the way that I would want. Like, yeah, Sonic can go upside down and through loops without scripting, but they never really take advantage of this. There are incredibly few instances where going through a loop or something isn't scripted. It's just like, I don't know why they're not taking advantage of the system that they created. That's not to say that the physics of this game are perfect, not at all. Like, I think Sonic's default top speed is way too high, and I think the turning is overly stiff, especially when you're moving at low speeds, which I think is responsible for a lot of the awkward-feeling controls that a lot of people have issue with when it comes to 3D platforming. And a couple of things still don't really work the way you would necessarily want them to, like jumping off walls and ceilings doesn't exactly work how you would want it to in this game. And there's a really weird thing where if you're trying to turn while in the air, then Sonic is just not going to do anything if you try to turn too sharply. And in 2D sections, this is especially odd because it means that Sonic can't turn around if you're trying to move in the opposite direction from when you're facing, which means that if you want to air boost in that direction and Sonic's not facing it, then you just can't, which is really annoying, and it's just a weird thing that you have to get used to. There's also stuff in the game where at different points the physics are gonna like completely change depending on the section. You can see it on the speedometer where suddenly your top speed is gonna dramatically drop. And you can't really see it watching the video, but you can feel that your controls and the physics get slightly changed depending on the section of the gameplay. Most of the time it's perfectly fine. If you play the game in the way they want you to, then you're probably not even going to notice this is a thing, but it is a thing, though I don't think it's necessarily a huge problem, and it's pretty easy to get used to. It's such a shame, because coming back to this game and realizing how these physics and controls work, I'm like, dude, they could have totally made, like, a true physics-based 3D Sonic game, and they just chose not to for whatever reason. And that is a huge shame. But again, as I said before, and in my Sonic Adventure video, I don't feel it's fair to judge a game for what it isn't. You have to judge it for what it is. And what I think Sonic Unleashed is a very simple, shallow game that manages to be very, very fun due to its speed and its challenge, and I really like it a lot just based on those simple factors. Sonic Team wanted to get away from the adventure formula with this game and do something entirely new for Sonic, and what they came up with is something that I, similarly to the adventure games, don't think that this is the right direction to take 3D Sonic, but also similar to those games, I can't deny that I think the game is really, really fun. And, you know, it does still maintain a good amount of Sonic DNA to it. It still has that traditional tier-based level design, staying at the top is the fastest. It encourages time attack a lot. In fact, I haven't really talked about time attack in this game because, similar to the Rush games, time attack is like intrinsically linked to just playing the game. In fact, it's thanks to this game's simplicity that I started to realize that this is a big part of the core design of Sonic games. It is very apparent in these games that that's what you're supposed to be doing, as it just feels inherently satisfying to get better and better times on these levels and take more advantage of the boost. And because of that, I discovered the idea of time attacking Sonic games, and it deepened my love for the series. So I think that in that context, Sonic Unleashed is a great direction to take Sonic in because it introduced the idea of speeding through Sonic games to so many more people, and due to its more simple gameplay, it made that much more apparent and more easily accessible. More than any other previous Sonic game, even the original 2D ones, if you want to go fast and feel like you're in control and you're the one making Sonic go fast, no game gets you to that point as quickly and as easily as the Boost Sonic games. Like I said, they give you an insane amount of speed with just the press of a button, but it's up to you whether or not you want to press that button. Do you think you can handle the speed? Are you up to it? If so, you can make this game pretty fucking fast. It's all up to you. It's totally in the player's control, which is a lot easier for players to understand than figuring out how to properly manipulate the terrain in order to go quickly, which is more fun and rewarding, but also a lot of players are gonna totally miss that stuff, so it's a trade-off. And in general, the Boost games are a lot more focused on that time attack style gameplay. Like, they really, really, really lean into it a lot, to the point where if you're not really doing that, then I think that you're missing like 90% of what makes these games fun, which naturally is going to mean that they're going to appeal to me quite a bit. And in general, I find that the core moment-to-moment gameplay of these games feels a lot closer to the original 2D Sonic games, just in terms of how they feel, due to their similarity to the Rush games, which also in some ways feel similar to the classic Sonic games, which is also something I like about them quite a bit, and all of these things contribute to the overall reason why these are my preference for 3D Sonic games, even if I still don't think that they are my ideal idea of what a 3D Sonic game could be. And there you have it. There are my thoughts on the core Sonic gameplay of Sonic Unleashed. However, we are far from done from talking about this game, because there is a whole lot more to this game than just the core Sonic gameplay, and we're going to talk about all of that in Part 2. Because while these core main levels during the daytime are great, when night starts to fall in Sonic Unleashed, things change quite a bit.